Thank you all for coming today to the commemoration for one of our local men, Victor Bown. Victor didn't start off life as a Banstead man. He was born in the tiny village of Charlton All Saints, down in Wiltshire. His parents were both local. They came from either side of the river down there. His father was a cowman, and his mother was in service. And after they married, about 3 years after they married, they had Victor, their eldest son, the first of their 3 children. They were always on the move with Victor's dad, Tom's work. He moved from farm to farm, town to town, and county to county. So they started off by moving from Wiltshire to the far side of Dorset, and they ended up living in all kinds of locations in Hampshire and Sussex and Surrey before they finally came here to Banstead. They had, as I said, Victor was the first of 3 children born to them. He had a younger brother, Wallace, and a younger sister, Alberta. And the family, wherever they were, they would always take their children back to their home parish church of All Saints for their children to be baptised and to meet their extended family. Now, when Victor grew up, he became an under-gardener, but he didn't fancy that. That wasn't the career for him, and he decided he was going to enlist in the Royal Marines instead in 1900. It was the height of the Boer War. We'd been doing very badly at the start of the Boer War, but there'd just been a wave of victories in early 1900. The relief of Kimberley and Ladysmith, the capture of Bloemfontein, and the whole country was swept up in a wave of patriotic fervour. And it was under those circumstances that Victor decided he was going to attest with the Royal Marines. Now, he was only 16, and he had to be 17 to join the Navy, so he lied about his age, added a year, as many boys did at the time. And he joined the Royal Marines, enlisting at a recruiting office in London in early 1900. Now, the Royal Marines are the Navy's land fighting force, and they also provide guard details on ships, and also provide gunners for the Navy. So Victor's training was very much focused around that. He did infantry training on land at Deal in Kent and down in Gosport. He learned about sea gunnery, and of course he learned how to swim. Well, actually one of the most daunting requirements for many of the boys that were entering the Navy. Of course, many of them came from inland. They'd never been in a river, they'd never been in the sea, and that was actually the part of the course that most boys failed. But he passed his swimming test. He went through all his training with flying colours. Really, he was rated very good character, very good ability. And the final stage of his training was his first sea voyage aboard HMS Ariadne, a new cruiser that was just undergoing sea trials and went out for 5 weeks of manoeuvres. He obviously didn't get his sea legs, because within 3 days of getting back he decided he was going to buy himself out for his contract with the Navy. He signed up for 12 years, as you had to do with the Navy. It wasn't an easy option. 12 years you signed on for with the Army was 5 years with the colours and 7 years in the reserves, but the Navy was 12 years full-time in the Navy, a very, very long time. And it wasn't helped by the fact that they discovered his little deception about his age, which meant that he had to add another year's service on to the end of his 12 years and lost a year's worth of pension and benefits. He might have been a bit grumpy about that when he, and in that frame of mind, when he left the Royal Marines. He joined went back to live with his family, who'd moved to Sussex. By that point, his dad's still working as a cowman and a dairyman. And he moved around with them until he came to Banstead. Sometime in that period, unfortunately, he lost his younger sister. Childhood deaths very common in those ages, and I think she was about 10 years old when she died. But they came to Banstead in about 1910, 1911. First of all, moving to a house that was then called Lindene in Diceland Road, which is now number 68, a semi-detached villa. The family then moved around the corner a couple of years later to Ferndale Road, so what's now number 60, but was called the Ferns, then a semi-detached cottage. It had been run as the whole area up by the Banstead Road was like a separate village in its own right, had lots of different shops. And number 60 seems to have been a toy shop and a stationer's before the Bowns moved in. The family, the parents and their 2 boys lived there. Tom was still working as a cowman. We don't know what Victor was doing in the decade or so after he left the Navy, but when he came to Banstead, he found a job at Banstead Asylum. Now, the asylum, they called it described as a medical city with over 2,000 patients. And they needed to be as self-sufficient as possible, so they had their own farms. Originally they had what's called Ferndale Farm, or the 100 Acres Farm. And then in 1912 they expanded to buy Fairlawn Farm, which is still there today, and actually contains the asylum's old graveyard. And if you were here back in April, we went to visit a grave for one of our men that's buried there. Now, Victor worked as a labourer on the farm. There were several local men, including another World War I casualty that we're going to be commemorating next year. And he signed up for a 54-hour working week for about 28 shillings pay each week. He would have worked as a cowman and a labourer, and he would have had help from the inmates, the patients at Banstead Asylum. About 100 patients would be working in the fields each day alongside the small paid workforce. It was a good job working for the council, had good benefits, it was good steady pay. He could expect to see his salary increasing year on year. And so it was that in 1915 he was already earning more than 30 shillings a week. We don't have really PALS battalions in this area. That seems to be more of a northern thing, but there were local battalions that were raised, particularly in London, by the mayors of different boroughs, for example. And then one of the nearest things we have to that for the artillery is a brigade of field artillery that were raised for the Croydon and Norbury area. They were called the Empire Brigade, and they were raised by the Empire Committee, sort of a group of grandees of ex-military men and diplomats that worked together to promote the British Empire. And they raised two brigades of field artillery. And the first of these was raised in early 1915. And it was this brigade that Victor first joined. Now, he signed on with them in June of 1915 and went to train with them at Lewes down in Sussex, so not too far from home. While he was away, and while all of the asylum men were away, the council continued to pay their wages. They kept their jobs open. They hired temporary labourers to replace Victor and his colleagues. And it was the criteria was made clear that these were not to be enlistable men. These were only old men, and their jobs would revert back to the permanent employees at the end of the war. So they continued to pay Victor's salary, and his mother would go down to the cash office every week to sign for that, along with all the other parents of about 50 or so asylum staff who were off fighting the war in various different places. After training in Lewes, they were sent to France in November of 1915. They were supporting the 36th Division, the Ulster Division, who'd been raised from the men of the Ulster Volunteer Force. It's interesting how things have turned out. The Ulster Volunteer Force were preparing to fight Britain, to fight against Home Rule when war broke out, but they were co-opted into the British Army and became a very successful part of our army on the Western Front. So Victor went out to France to join them in November of 1915, and after a few months' training, they found themselves on the Somme. This was about 3 months before the Battle of the Somme started, so they had plenty of time to prepare their positions and to familiarise themselves with the local terrain. They were opposite the village of Thiepval, in the north of what would become the Somme battlefield, a village with a chateau perched high on a ridge. It was to prove to be a formidable obstacle during the Battle of the Somme itself. Victor's brigade's job was to cut the wire in front of Thiepval for the infantry assault that was going to go over on the 1st of July. And they did it very, very slowly and very, very methodically. They only did it when they could see where the shell was falling, and they took time after each shell to note where it had fallen and adjust their shot afterwards. And in that slow and methodical way, they very, very successfully cut the gaps in the wire at Thiepval. And when the men of the Ulster Division went over the top, they were one of the few British divisions in the northern part of the battlefield to make any kind of progress through the German wire at all. So they knew exactly where the gaps were, and those gaps had been kept open by Victor's brigade. The other brigades either side of them failed in their attack on the 1st of July, and the Ulstermen were exposed in a little mini salient, and unfortunately they were forced almost all the way back to the British lines. And it would be 3 months after that before British soldiers would be standing just north of Thiepval. We have a bit of a problem now because Victor's service records have not survived. And we know that he transferred to another brigade, 232 brigade, but we don't know when or under what circumstances. There are two most likely scenarios. The first is he remained with his brigade on the Somme through the summer, and then went off elsewhere before returning, and then went off to Belgium, and remained there until 1917. The other is that he transferred via another brigade to his eventual destination and fought on the Somme throughout the rest of the summer, and then fought at the Battle of Arras in the spring of 1917. Whatever happened to him, we know that in June, July of 1917, he was with C Battery of 232 Brigade of the Royal Field Artillery, and they were in Belgium near the town of Ypres. Now, Ypres had been where the British and German armies had met in November of 1914. They fought an encounter battle there, and then trench lines started to develop. It was the end of the Mobile War. And what had happened was, eventually after months and months of fighting, the Germans held the high ground. There was sort of a semicircle of hills, low hills, and these are not much higher than the High Street is above Winkworth Lane. They're not, Winkworth Road is not that high at all. About 3 miles distant from the town. So you're facing east out of Ypres at the moment. You have the town ramparts here, the Menin Gate here, and you'd be looking towards the hills over there. Up here in this corner you'd have the infamous village of Passchendaele, where the ridge sort of peters out, and then sweep across here and curve back towards you, about 2, 3, 4 miles away, 2 miles at its closest. And there would be a shoulder of ground as it curved around. And then the line would curve in another salient, a German salient, as the ridge continued around in a curve, like an inverted sort of S shape. Now, that big ridge over there of high ground had observation over most of the Ypres salient. So the German artillery observers could see where the British troops were. We couldn't really dig trenches very well because the soil wasn't very good for that. It was very waterlogged, very clay. It flooded very easily, so the trenches were very shallow. And there weren't very many communication trenches that men could go up, and they'd have to make their way to the trenches over land. So if you could be seen, it was very dangerous. Any movement would result in shelling. And at night, if you were a gunner, the flash of your gun firing would tell the observers where your battery was, and you could expect a salvo from the Germans in reply very shortly afterwards. So we needed to get these Germans off this ridge here. We wanted eventually to push on through all of that high ground into the Belgian coast. But first of all, we had to get them off that shoulder. And a plan was launched. It was 2 years in the preparation. We were digging tunnels underneath that ridge, Messine's Ridge, and planted 25 mines totaling 500 tonnes of high explosives. We were going to blow them up on the 7th of June 1917 and force the Germans off the ridge. And infantry, waves and waves of infantry would follow those huge explosions over, and we'd hope to find the Germans dead or stunned beyond help. Now, Victor's brigade was to support that attack. Last week we commemorated George Blunt, a man who had fought in that attack, and Victor's artillery brigade were quite near him actually. They were just down to his right, near the village of Saint-Éloi, just where this line is starting to curve around and change direction. There was a raised area of ground called the Mound, which was an artillery observation point, and the largest of the mines was planted under that. When it went off, the men just couldn't help themselves from looking at it. They'd never seen anything like it. The most amazing thing they'd seen. They were stunned almost by their own mine, and their officers had to shout at them and whip them across no man's land. Victor was just to the right of that, supporting the infantry of 19th Division. They didn't have any mines in that sector, but it didn't matter. Those other explosions and the week of preliminary bombardment had done their job extremely well, and the infantry experienced very little resistance, particularly in the early stages of their advance. And they reached most of their objectives that day, and after just another week's fighting, they'd achieved everything they set out to do. It was an amazing success for the British Army, and it cleared the way for that assault to take this other high ground here, what would become the Third Battle of Ypres, also known as Passchendaele. But during that battle over there, Battle of Messines, the weather had been really good, but it started to turn unsettled in the middle of July, a harbinger of things to come. The Victor's Brigade moved into their battle positions on the 9th of July. They were near Dickerbush Lake. They were quite quite exposed where they were. The Germans would be able to see where they were. And as soon as they started getting into action, they started attracting attention from the Germans. A few days after they'd gone into action for the first time, the Germans used mustard gas, Yellow Cross shells, for the very first time. They shelled Ypres and caused about 2,000 casualties in one day on the first day they used those. And eventually these mustard gas shells started falling onto Victor's battery as well. It was more of an irritant than a lethal gas at most times, because the men's new gas masks were very effective against it. But one of the unfortunate effects for the battery was that the mustard gas was very, very corrosive. It would corrode metal, and so it was very damaging to the guns. So one of the batteries of Victor's brigade was actually forced out of action due to gas corrosion. They bombarded the high ground just where it starts to curve there, up by the village of Hoog. That was where the division they were going to be supporting would be attacking. The ground rises very, very slightly on the road from Ypres up to Hoog. There's a lovely cafe there now, you can go and visit if you want to, and a museum as well. It wouldn't have been a pleasant place to be at that time. It was where the front line had been for most of the last 2 years. There'd been a lot of fighting there. There's a huge crater. Until the Messines mines went up, it was the biggest, or until the Somme mines went up, sorry, it was the biggest crater on the western front. And there was a lot of very bitter fighting there. And behind this little village of Hoog and its ruined chateau was Bellewaerde Lake, where some of our local men had fought, where horrendous gas casualties had been inflicted in 1915. Behind that, the ground rose through the remains of some woods to a ridge, Bellewaerde Ridge, just 10, 20 metres higher than the area around it. And beyond that, another ridge, the West Turk Ridge. And Bellewaerde and West Turk Ridge were the objectives for the division that Victor's brigade were going to be supporting. 8th Division went over the top on the 31st of July and fought their way up from the village of Hoog, either side of Bellewaerde Lake, onto Bellewaerde Ridge, over Bellewaerde Ridge, and to the Germans' second set of lines, the village of West Turk and West Turk Ridge. They captured the village, they captured the lines, counterattacks through the day forced them back just onto the British side of the village. The troops to the right of them got hung up at Glencorse Wood and Inverness Copse, and the advance there was not a success, so it left 8th Division in a very exposed position where they couldn't advance any further. To their left, over that way, a low ridge halfway to the high ground, Pilkham Ridge, was fought over by the rest of 5th Army, and it was gained, the first line of German defences, and they progressed even further, but not as far as the high ground. And they couldn't go any further until the area that Victor, the area that the division Victor was supporting were attacking. They couldn't go anywhere over here until that area was fully in British hands. The defences up there were much more developed than they were down here. There were an awful lot of artillery there, and observers up there could see all these men down here and call that artillery down to enfilade to shoot along the length of the trenches that the men were in here. So that area had to be cleared. So at the end of that first day of the battle of the Third Battle of Ypres, the weather, which had been unsettled, took a decided turn for the worse, and heavens opened, and torrential rain poured down pretty much non-stop for about 4 days. And it turned the whole battlefield famously into a sea of mud. The streams that ran down between the ridges had been torn apart by shell fire. Their courses had disappeared completely, and they were just lines of water-filled shell holes. And as that torrential rain came down, the areas just flooded, and they turned those streams into bogs. They were many, many feet deep. Some have been recorded as being about 11 feet deep of mud, deep enough that people would drown in them if they lost their footing. And the infantry operations had to be brought to a halt as a result of that. It was just too much hard work trying to get forward. So to clear that ground, rather than renew the whole offensive and hope it happened, they decided they'd have a dedicated operation to capture West Turk Ridge. And that was 100 years ago today. 3 divisions of 2 corps were lined up to take part in the attack, the 18th, 24th and the 25th. The 18th were on the left. They were the division that Victor's brigade was supporting, and they were once more trying to fight their way to West Turk Village and West Turk Ridge, while other troops to the right attacked Glencorse Wood and Inverness Copse. They started off at 4:35 in the morning, Victor's battery and his brigade providing a protective barrage, a creeping barrage for the men, proved to be very effective. They overran the German outposts of the village of Westhurk. They captured the village itself with its intact strong points. Many of the German soldiers there had had enough and they surrendered. But the more formidable defences were actually further on, in what the Germans called the battle zone. And these were all the pillboxes and bunkers and snipers' nests dotted around that would break up any waves of infantry that were advancing towards them. Behind them, in reserve, were dedicated counter-attacking divisions that would come forward and smash the survivors from the pillbox assaults. And that's what happened that day. The men went forward. They couldn't get much further forward than that line because of all those pillboxes and machine guns, particularly on the far side of the valley on their left. They couldn't cross the valley because it was just a sea of mud, and so they were just being picked off from a distance. The Germans brought down a box barrage. They basically cut off, drew a sort of rectangle around all these men and cut them off from reinforcement and resupply, and just held them there while they started to bring up their counter-attacking divisions. Now, Victor's battery's job at that point was then to switch from providing a protective barrage for the men to bombarding the counter-attackers as they came in. And this they did very successfully. And the men at Westhurk did not lose many casualties to infantry after that point, although they did lose many men to the artillery barrage that was coming down. Unfortunately, the divisions on the right of the 18th Division failed, as they had done just a couple of weeks beforehand, and the operation was not a success. It's not dignified with a name. It's not the Battle of Westhurk. It's sometimes the failure of Westhurk, unfortunately, in the histories that are written of the battle. But Westhurk village was reached, and it was in no small part due to the part played by the artillery that was supporting them that day. The German shells rained down on our British batteries. They knew exactly where they were. They hadn't moved for weeks. And unfortunately, Victor was killed at some point during that day, probably by a German shell. He's commemorated here in Banstead in many places. Unfortunately, his name's spelt wrong on the Banstead Village Memorial. There's Victor Brown on there. And he's probably commemorated in his home village as well. He's also commemorated in Burheath, one of our few men to be commemorated in both villages, and we have no idea why, unfortunately, at this time. We're now going to toll the bell 100 times.